Well, I want to welcome everybody to this session entitled Effective Preaching. So, crafting a message that feeds believers and yet at the same time engages the non-believer. So, I'm curious. My name is Aaron Brockett, and I'm the lead pastor of a church in Indianapolis. How many of you are regularly preaching, just on a regular basis right now? All right. How many of you want to be preaching on a regular basis? All right. So, okay, every hand should go back up. All right. So that's good to know. I just kind of like to know the room that I'm speaking to. So let me go ahead and we're going to dive in. I've got a lot of material. I also want this to be really helpful to you. So feel free anytime to kind of stop, raise your hand, ask a clarifying question, disagree with something, ask me to clear something up. I want to be able to do that as we work through this material together. And then at the very end, we can save some time for a little bit of Q&A at the end. So let me go ahead and pray for our time together, and then we'll get started. How many Charles Spurgeon fans in the room? Any Spurgeon fans? All right. Well, I read about this time where Spurgeon was actually counseling and trying to teach a group of young pastors. There was a guy that was articulate, he was young, he was good looking, very sure of himself, and Spurgeon was sitting in the room, and these young men were going up and they were preaching in front of Spurgeon, and Spurgeon would give feedback, if you can imagine. And so there was this young man, or very articulate, good-looking guy, jumps up, springs up to the front full of energy, full of pride, and really wanted to impress Spurgeon with this sermon. But as he gets started, he ends up fumbling his notes. His notes fell off the pulpit down onto the ground. He never recovered. So he leans down, he's trying to get his sermon notes together, totally knocked off of his routine, his train of thought, doesn't even finish the sermon, and just kind of shuffles off the stage, really humbled. Takes his seat next to Spurgeon. Spurgeon leans over to him, and he simply said to him, if you had gone up the way you came down, you could have come down the way you went up. And I think that one of the things that God will do in each of our lives is that He'll give you a call to preach, and then He'll humble you in that call to preach. It's where you end up feeling the challenge, you end up feeling the weight and the responsibility of what you've been tasked to do, to be the spokesperson of God's Word. So I'll just share with you a little bit of my calling to preach. I am, I think, one of the most unlikely people to ever be in the role of preaching on a weekly basis. I grew up in a really small town in the southwest part of the state of Missouri. Any of you heard of Missouri? Yeah, you haven't missed much. All right, that's where I grew up. My grandfather's a first-generation Christian. So none of our family were Christians until my grandfather. He gave his life to Christ when he served in the army, and then he became a preacher. And I kind of grew up listening to him preach, and was the furthest thing from him. And so I didn't think that I would ever be used in ministry. I'm kind of a quiet guy. I'm an introvert by nature. I always thought that preachers were guys who loved to be in front of people, could have been a salesman if they weren't a preacher, but then they became a Christian and decided to be a preacher. And I just thought that that was never me. And when I was in high school, I didn't know what I was going to do after I graduated. To go to college, I had a good friend who was going to go to Bible college. I'd never heard of it. I didn't know what it was. And so I decided to go to Bible college my first year out of high school just to get some Christian Bible classes before then heading on to the university. And it was while I was there that I was at it was called a preaching teaching convention. So the school would bring in preachers from all over the country, and they would, it was like two or 3 days straight of just solid preaching. And during that time, I had never heard God's Word kind of illuminated in the way that it was during that week for me. And I remember there was a session where the preacher was talking about the call to preach. And he said, this is the greatest job in the world. If you get an opportunity to make clear God's Word to others who it is unclear to, and it's the greatest job in the world when God can take your personality and speak through it. And then he said these words that really convicted me. He said, I really believe that there's somebody here today who God's calling you to preach, but you've never even considered it. Your ears have been deaf to it. Your eyes have been blind to it. You need to open up your eyes. You need to open up your ears. And have you ever been in a room or a church setting where it felt as if the preacher or the communicator was talking directly to you and everybody else kind of melted away? And that was that experience for me. I was sitting on the back row, as all good young first-year college students did. And I felt like everybody else in the room disappeared, and it was just me and this guy, and it was as if God was calling me to preach, and I didn't want to hear it. I don't know about you and your specific testimony. It wasn't like I jumped willfully into it. I was like, man, God, you dialed the wrong number. I can't do this. And I remember getting up and walking out of the chapel, went back to my dorm room, and wrestled with God about it for the next several hours. And then came across the passage in John, he must become greater and I must become less. And I remember getting down on my knees in that dorm room and just simply saying, God, if you want me to preach, okay, but it's going to be awful. You know, people are going to hate it. You're going to hate it. You're going to pull me back out of it. And literally that's how I felt, but I kind of surrendered to it. And I got a phone call the very next week, and the president of our Bible college was supposed to go to a church in the state of Arkansas to preach, but he couldn't make it. So he wanted to know if I would fill in for him. Now, keep in mind, I was 18 years old, never preached a sermon in my life, never had a homiletics class yet, and I was like, okay, here we go, right? And so my passage that I selected was the Great Samaritan. Totally butchered the theology of it. Wrote a 25-page manuscript, word for word, and went to this small church in Arkansas, walked in. I think there were maybe 50 people in the church. Walked up to the front, big, huge, giant wood pulpit up front. Got my 25-page manuscript together, trembling lips, trembling hands. Walked up, prayed, looked down at my notes, read through my notes, never once looking up. Finished the sermon in 8 minutes, literally. Got done, prayed, walked off the stage, sat down in the front, I couldn't even remember what had just transpired over the previous 8 minutes. But thinking, that's probably not exactly what God called me to do. I don't think I did very well there. And afterwards, there was about 4 elders in that church that asked that they could see me afterwards. And I thought I was in trouble. And I didn't know how this worked. I mean, I was only 18, never preached before, never been in a church. These 4 elders took me off into a side classroom, and they circled around me and they said, have you ever preached before? And I said, no, it's my first time. And they said, yeah, we could tell. And I thought they were going to send me back to the school with a note saying this young man should never preach again. You know, I'll be blacklisted, you know, from preaching. But they surrounded me and they said, you know, we just really sensed that even though your sermon needs, you know, you still need a lot of work. We just have this sense that God's calling you to preach. Do you feel that way? And I was totally blown away by that whole exchange. To this day, I don't know the names of those men. I've never talked to them ever again, but God used them in such a pivotal way because they circled around me. They affirmed this call. I'd never even really talked about what had happened in my dorm room the previous week with anybody. And yet these 4 guys came around me. They said, we really feel God's calling you to preach. We want to encourage you to keep going. Could we lay hands on you and pray before you go back to school? And I remember getting done, walking out to my car, fumbling for my keys, opening up the door, sitting down in the front seat, shutting the door. And there for a moment before starting up the car, I prayed and I said, God, that was the scariest thing I've ever done in my life. And I can't wait to do it again. And that's kind of the journey that I've been on, this kind of process where God calls somebody who isn't looking for it, feels inadequate to do it, and yet God wants to speak through them. And if you look through the scriptures, when God calls individuals to be mouthpieces for Him, isn't that the case with almost any one of them? I mean, I'm preaching through a series on the life of Moses right now. That's Moses' story, right? What did Moses say to God when God called him to be His spokesman? I mean, he argued with Him over and over again and just said, God, I don't speak good. You know, I can't talk. I can't get up and preach in front of others. And God says, go where I tell you to go and say what I tell you to say. And we've been given this initial call to preach. Now, here's the thing. Putting together I want you to think back. How many of you can remember the very first sermon you preached? All right. How many of you liked it? Happy if you did. Good. I'm glad your story is different than mine. But here's the thing: you ever get that assignment? You said, you know what? You got to preach a sermon, and you need to preach it 1 month from now, or however long it was, 2 weeks from now, or 6 months from now, and you got all this time to do your commentary work, do your word studies, do the history background, come up with fresh illustrations, figure out how you're going to introduce it, figure out how you're going to bring it to a close. You got all that time. And so you spend, I don't know, how many hours do you think that putting together that first sermon? And then have you ever gotten into an assignment where you're going to preach in a church on a regular basis, and so you pour all this time into one sermon, and then you wake up and you realize, I got to do that 7 days from now all over again? That's a different animal, isn't it? Where you get all this time to put together one sermon, but then when you find yourself in a regular preaching role and you've got to build that sermon and get ready to preach largely to the same group of people, the same congregation. So they, for me, I've been preaching at Traders Point now for almost 6 years. I used up all my best illustrations after 2 months, right? And then you're like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? I've told the best stories, and you burn through all that stuff, and then you kind of get down to this very essence of what it means to be a great preacher. And so preaching biblical messages on a regular weekly basis that is true to the text, that's fresh, that's insightful, that's filled with passion. It's convicting for people that are all over the map in their beliefs, because that's a different thing as well, right? Within your churches, you're going to have committed believers that know the Bible better than you do, some of them. And then you've got people that are kind of growing in their faith. And then hopefully you've got unbelievers, people that have never been exposed to Bible teaching, or they think they know what the Bible says, but they've never really read it for themselves. You've got all those people sitting out in front of you, and your task is to deliver fresh bread every 7 days. And that is a daunting task that's very difficult. In fact, Charles Spurgeon himself, which has a pretty good reputation for knowing how to preach a sermon, Charles Spurgeon himself even talked about his frustration with preaching as despair. The analogy that Spurgeon used is he described weekly preaching like punching the mist. He's just like, you just can't ever get upper hand on it, and it's just this kind of frustration that you have. For me, the analogy that I'll often use when it comes to weekly preaching is I feel oftentimes that preaching feels a little bit like being a quarterback in American football, and you feel like you're going to get sacked. That's just how I feel. That's just the analogy that I feel. Because every week when I step up to preach, I'm at the line of scrimmage, and I hike the ball, and there's this defensive line of skeptics, unbelievers, believers who think, wow, he's awfully young. I don't think he could teach me anything I don't already know, right? Given by some of the age in this room, you've probably been exposed to that. Wow, you're awfully young to be a preacher. What could you ever teach me? And so they'll sit out there like this, no facial expression. You've got all these people that are kind of sacking you, so to speak, and you're kind of scrambling around in the line of scrimmage. So what makes preaching so difficult? And I want you to think about that. And so you can maybe write that in your notes. If some of you are taking notes, I want us to think about that a little bit. What is it that makes preaching so difficult? And I think one is what we've already pointed out, and that's just the preparation. And one of the things that you might want to do, if you haven't already, is just ask yourself, how much time do I need to prepare a biblical sermon that's fresh in its approach and has a great application for my people? How many hours do you think it would take you? And sit down. And now, it should, in the very beginning, it should take you longer in the very beginning than it does once you've been preaching for a while. Just because you begin to kind of learn the drill and you begin to learn how to do that preparation. But I think that's important for you to clarify and to understand and to keep track of. But preparation is one. I think just our own personal insecurity is another. How many of you enjoy listening to yourself preach? Yeah, I hate it. Unfortunately, all of my sermons are online for the world to see, and I hate it. It's like I know that it's Howard Hendricks, the late Howard Hendricks. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. He said it's not experience that makes you better; it's evaluated experience. I hate that, right? I don't want to evaluate. my sermons, but I know I need to. And so I'll come into the office on Monday, fire up my sermon, and watch the video. I can maybe make it 5 minutes into it before I shut it off in disgust. Because I don't like the way I deliver. I don't like the little, the ticks that nobody likes the way that they look. So that all kind of comes out. You're just your own insecurity in preaching. It's kind of a double-edged sword. Some preachers can be too arrogant, but most of us aren't sure enough of ourselves. And it's still rooted in the same thing. We're thinking about ourselves too much. Just personal doubt, criticism is a big one. There's always going to be somebody in your church that's going to be your thorn in the flesh. Somebody who's going to come up and you really need encouragement, and then they criticize something you said, or I don't know that it means that, and you end up getting criticized. And so all this makes weekly preaching so difficult, given the fact that I think there is such a thing as your church getting listeners fatigue. They listen to you every single week, so they know where you're going. They've heard the illustrations, and so sometimes that can kind of be difficult as well. All this stuff kind of piles up against you. And Bryan Chapell, who his book Christ-Centered Preaching, if you've never read that, I think it's one of the premier works on biblical preaching that's out there. Bryan Chapell's Christ-Centered Preaching. And he said this, he said, when preachers perceive the power that the Word holds, confidence in their calling grows, even as pride in their performance withers. And I've held on to that truth for many, many years. Repeat the what? The author? Yeah, the author is Bryan Chapell. And the title of the book is Christ-Centered Preaching. And that quote is in that book. So let me give you this. What is called the 10 deadly sins of preaching. All right? 10 deadly sins of preaching. This will kill you. It will destroy your passion over the long haul. It will burn you out if you are susceptible to any one of these. And the first one is, I would say, is the temptation to be inauthentic. The temptation to be inauthentic. Any of you ever heard a preacher and you thought, I don't believe them? Or they're trying to pretend to be somebody they're not. That's inauthenticity. And I would say that every young preacher is going to start off, and there's going to at least be a trace of inauthenticity in them, and it's unintentional. It's just you're trying to figure out your own voice. You're trying to figure out how you would say it instead of how your favorite preacher would say it. And I've certainly been guilty of trying to parrot or imitate my favorite preachers, and some of you probably have as well. And sometimes you just do it unintentionally because you've heard them and you think, that's how God's Word came to life for you. So you're like, that's how it needs to sound like. And so you end up sounding like, just fill in the blank. John Piper, Tim Keller, whoever. You're just trying to do your best. And it's like karaoke. It's not you. It's you doing an impression of them. And it's never as good. Because if I wanted to listen to John Piper, I wouldn't listen to you impersonating John Piper. I'd just go listen to John Piper, right? And so I'm going to get to this here in just a little bit. But there's a guy named Malcolm Gladwell who wrote a book called The Tipping Point. And he said in there's something called the 10,000 hour rule, meaning it takes you 10,000 hours to become an expert in anything. This is how Bill Gates learned to be a software engineer, is because whenever he was in college, his college gave him access to computers that nobody else had. So all of his free time, he was writing computer programming in his free time, and it ended up equaling up somewhere in the approximation of 10,000 hours. The guy became an expert in it. And so 10,000 hours of preaching. I don't know how many times you'd have to preach to get that, but I will say, I had a mentor 15 years ago say to me, it takes a minimum of 300 sermons for you to even begin to figure out what your voice is. So I don't know if that encourages you or discourages you, but it's meant to encourage you. Hang in there. It's sort of like driving a stick shift. When you first learn to drive a stick shift, you just grind through the gears. It's not very pretty, but in preaching you do the same thing. And you just get up there week after week after week and find your voice. Don't be inauthentic. Be yourself. All right, here's the second temptation. The temptation to live for recognition. And so you see the preachers with the big churches and a lot of the recognition, or you think, man, that guy just has it all, and wow. And so you end up thinking, that's the way to do that. It always amazes me when I have young preachers come up to me and say, man, I want to do what you do. How do I get into that? It's like, well, you just start where God has you. You're not going to start with the big platform. You start and you're just faithful, and God blesses as you're faithful. If you're trying to preach to get recognition, your motivation's wrong. And I think most of you in this room probably know that. But it's a temptation, even for the most humble of us, right? I mean, every single week in the same sermon, somebody will come up to me and say words to me that, if I'm not careful, could inflate my ego. And then the person in line right behind them will come up and say something to me that, if I'm not careful, by what they just said, I never want to preach again. Who's right? Well, you know what? They're both right. I'm not worthy of it, and yet God speaking through me is He's able to accomplish more through me than I could ever accomplish on my own. Here's this third temptation, the temptation to fear. A little bit of fear is good. Paralyzing fear is not. And I would say that every time you get ready to take your pulpit and to deliver God's word, there should be a little bit of fear in you, but it needs to be the right kind of fear. Not fear of what others will think of your content and delivery, but fear of what God thinks of the message. I like to say it this way. When I'm preaching, I want to preach to an audience of one. That at the end of the day, regardless of the person who thought it was great or the person who thought it was horrible, what did God think of it? Was God honored through it? Was I faithful to the text through it? And that's what I should be fearful of. So, but the temptation to be crippled in fear, like, oh, these people are going to hate me, they're not going to like this, that's a temptation that you've got to work through. Here's the next one. I think it's number 4, the temptation to comparison. So you're always going to compare yourself to maybe someone else who you think is really a great preacher. Don't do that. Learn from them. But God has called you, your story, your personality to communicate His word through. God wants to hear His word delivered through you, not necessarily in comparison to somebody else. Because God will use you to speak to somebody that other people will never be able to reach. And so take that to heart. Here's number 5, the temptation to exaggerate. Man, as preachers, we are tempted to do this, aren't we? It could come in a number of ways. We end up making ourselves look too good in illustrations. We exaggerate the situation to make the story more interesting than it really is. And your people can sniff that out. They'll know it. And what ends up happening is that they go, man, if you're going to exaggerate or even lie about a little detail in a personal illustration, then how can I trust you with the text? That's what they're thinking. So be careful of that temptation. That's something I have to temper an awful lot. If I have an inordinate number of people come up to me after a sermon and say, no, here's what they'll do. They won't come up to me. They'll come up to my wife. And they'll say, did he really say that? Did that really happen? Then I know that I've come really close to exaggeration, and I need to be careful. Number 6, the temptation to feel chronically inadequate. Now, feeling inadequate you should always carry with you, because you are inadequate. But chronic inadequate, the feeling of just chronically feeling inadequate, like, oh, man, I'm no good, or I'll never be able to preach as well as such and such. That is going to cripple and handicap your preaching for a long, long time. There should be a humble confidence within you. The next one is the temptation for pride. So that's just kind of a given. It's just feeling too good about our delivery and our content. The temptation to manipulate. And what I mean by that is there are some preachers that can cry on cue. They do it in the same place every sermon. Or their lips begin to quiver. Or at the very end, especially when you're trying to draw out an invitation, We're going to sing one more time through that, or whatever it is. You're trying to manipulate an emotion. That's different from addressing an emotion, which you certainly should do. I mean, the sermon should make its way from your head to your heart, but manipulation is an entirely different thing. So we need to be careful about that. Here's the 9th one, the temptation to envy. You envy someone else's pulpit, you envy someone else's delivery, someone else's content. And the last one is the temptation to anger. And preaching needs to be filled with conviction, but if it crosses over into the line of a rant or just anger, or you're being even mean to your people, that's a different thing. I'm all about being very bold, and I'll talk about that here in a few minutes. Wayne Smith, who is a preacher from Kentucky, I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Wayne Smith. He's been retired now for about 15 years. Wayne could use humor better than anybody I've ever heard in a sermon. But Wayne was very intentional about it. He would say, I like to get people laughing, and then I slit their throat. Meaning, let me disarm them with humor, and then I'm going to come in and convict them. That's a different thing. When you can be bold and say some very direct, hard things in humility and love, that's so effective. Because I don't know about you and your context in America, there's kind of this perception that a preacher will just say whatever he can say to try to get more people to come to his church. So let me water it down, make you feel good so you'll come back. So when I stand up and say something very bold and step on somebody's toes, I think what that does in the mind of a skeptic is they say, that has to be true because if he was wanting to get me to come back to his church, he wouldn't have said that. Does that make sense to everyone? And so you can be bold and say some very direct things, but be careful about crossing over into just anger and a tirade, pounding the pulpit, whatever. Just be careful about that temptation, all right? Any questions on the 10 temptations of preaching, or the 10 deadly sins of preaching? All right, let me go on to this next section here. Let me just give you 5 things that we do instead of preaching. And all this is building up to a point, all right? So 5 things that we do instead of preaching. And the first one would be what we might call entertaining. And behind this idea is that, and especially in America, this is true. I don't know if this is true in your context, but the idea behind this is that they say that people's attention spans are short. Do you have that? People saying that? So like the average time of an American sitcom on TV is 23 minutes, and so the line of thinking goes that people can't pay attention for longer than 23 minutes, so your sermons need to accommodate that. I hate that. I think that's ridiculous, all right? And so it's this idea that their attention spans are short, so you need to do something to stimulate their interest. Don't go too deep or you'll lose them. If you don't use enough stories, they're going to be bored, and that's not preaching. And I think I'd simply say this, is that if you're bored with the text, then your people will be bored with it. But if you're excited about it and passionate about it, then your people will be excited about it as well. They'll be captivated by it, and they can tell when you're passionate. I don't know how many times, after a sermon, somebody will come up and they'll just say, man, we just really felt like you were speaking from the heart. Or it was at one point where it just seemed like you flipped a switch and you were sharing from your heart. And I don't know exactly when that happens in the sermon. I will say this, that I try to preach without notes because whenever you make eye contact with people, something significant happens. Don't look over their heads. Don't look down at the ground. Don't stay buried in your notes, but look them in the eye. And a little bit I'll do. I'll pick out the person in our room that to me seems the most disengaged with what I'm saying, and I'll stare them down until they look at me. And it gets awkward sometimes, especially when they're kind of up close. And I'll have people come up to me and they're like, man, it sure looks like you're looking directly at us. How do you do that? And I say, because I'm looking directly at you. And Andy Stanley, who is a preacher in Georgia, he said this. He said, every good preacher has notes, but not everybody needs to know you have notes. And so if you want something to get into somebody's heart, make sure it's in yours. And the best way for it to be in yours is to just have it internalized. Don't memorize it, internalize it. That's a different thing. It's the difference between microwaving material and putting it, I don't know what if you have this in your culture, but crock pot, do you know what that is? It's like where you just kind of slow cook something. And so you put this material in your mind, you marinate in it, you get your sermon done early. And I get my sermon done on Wednesday afternoon before I have to preach it on Sunday. That's how early I get it done. And then I just live in it for the next 3 or 4 days. So that way I'm fully marinated in it. So that way I can communicate directly in an authentic way. And so I don't want to entertain people, but I want to preach with passion and conviction. Martin Lloyd-Jones, who's one of my preaching heroes, he said preaching is theology coming through a man on fire. So that theology gets lit within you, and you're not just giving them material. Preaching is not a lecture. Preaching is not just content. Preaching is not just telling people what the text says. Preaching is theology coming through a man on fire. And people can see it. And when there is, it's what I would call spirit gravity. When there is Holy Spirit gravity in the room, you can literally feel people leaning in, like just waiting for it. And Dave Jamerson is on my staff. He's sitting in the back. He'll come up to me after a service because he'll be in the back of our room, and he'll say, man, at one point in your sermon, the whole room, it was like the air all got sucked out, and the whole room was like, just like waiting for it. I don't know how to fabricate or create those moments. All I know is just to prepare as well as you can, make sure that you're on fire with what you're going to say, and then the Holy Spirit will come into play there. So don't resist the urge to entertain people. Give them content and light it on fire. Here's the second thing we do instead of preaching is sharing. Let me just share with you today some of my thoughts on this passage. Little pet peeve for me is being in a Bible study, and somebody who's leading the Bible study will read a passage, let's just say out of John 12 or whatever. They'll read the passage and then they'll say, well, what the text meant to me was, what did the text mean to you? And I'm like, who cares what the text meant to you, right? What does the text mean? And I'm not just going to share some thoughts today. It's not just sharing some thoughts, it's proclamation. There needs to be a thus saith the Lord somewhere in the sermon. Preaching isn't suggestion, it's proclamation. And so once again, I already quoted Howard Hendricks, but I think he said when there is fog in the pulpit, there's mist in the pews, or maybe this the other way around. When you're not clear, they won't be either. And so be clear on it. The third thing is wooing. We woo instead of preach. And we try to water down, and we're just careful not to offend. So we just try to wow people, or we try to impress people. We try to do pop psychology with people, make them feel better. Let me just say this. If nobody walks away after hearing you preach saying, that is a hard word, who can accept it? Then you aren't preaching like Jesus. If nobody walks away going, wow, I don't know if I could do that, then you're not preaching like Jesus. So don't make it so palatable that it's easy for anyone. There should be some place where it's very hard. Here's the fourth thing we do instead of preaching. Intellectualizing. And so we spend an inordinate amount of time talking about what the commentaries say, doing the word studies, doing the historical background. Listen, all that stuff should be scaffolding for the application. What it is that God wants you to do with this. And that shouldn't be the sermon itself. And so the commentaries, the word studies, the historical background is vitally important. But it's important like your skeletal structure. But if you never get off of that, you're blowing it. If you never get out of that world and start to speak to the heart, then you're not preaching a biblical sermon. Biblical preaching must engage the hearer's minds, but the message has got to make its way to their heart. and it's ultimately got to make its way to their hands. So one of the things that I do is I write out just in front of my computer, what's this text say to the head? What does this text mean for the heart? And what is this text telling the hands to do? There needs to be those three things happening. And sometimes as preachers, we're just all about the hands. Let me just give you a practical message that works. And we avoid the head and the heart. Or we're all about the heart. Let me just tell you how the text moves you emotionally. And we avoid the other two. Or it's all about the head. Let me just tell you what it means. But I'm not going to tell you, we're not going to even get into how you should feel about it or what you should do with it. A good biblical preaching takes all three. So be careful when you're doing your prep that you don't, I don't know how long you preach. I'm a 45-minute guy. So if I spend 30 minutes on the head, how much time does that leave for the heart and the hands? I mean, you got to start to think about it that way. And some of you need to think about your natural bent. Some of you are naturally bent towards the head, right? That's a great thing. Some of you are naturally bent towards the heart. Some of you are naturally bent towards the hands. Wherever you're naturally bent towards, ask God to help you grow in the other two areas, and you'll be a better preacher. And your people will be better for it as well. Churches take on the personality of your preaching, by the way. That should scare you. It scares me because I know the deficiencies in my preaching, and my church has been receiving a steady diet of it for 6 years. So they're malnourished in some way. That's why I need, some of you to come guest speak at my church and give them something that I'm not necessarily giving them spiritually, nutrient-wise. But you need to think about all three of those. The fourth thing is abbreviating. Abbreviating. That's what we do instead of preaching. I don't know about your context or where you are, but one of the trends, I'm happy to see this starting to go away, but one of the trends in America in the 80s and 90s was shorter sermons. And this, I think, had to do with the seeker movement. Let's not lose people. Let's not bore people. Let's get them in and out. And so, honestly, there for the 90s, it was like 25-minute messages. Short, helpful, pithy, to the point. I'm grateful now that that's largely changing in America. It's starting to trend towards longer. Now, longer isn't always better. I mean, if it's longer, you need to make sure you've got... if you're starting off as a preacher, I wouldn't start off preaching 45 minutes. Because you just don't have the experience yet to now maybe you do, and if you do, that's awesome. Use it. God will be honored in it. But you got to figure that out. And the best thing for me is I can sense in the room when I'm losing people. I don't know if you can feel that way or not, but I feel it. And if I start to feel like people are starting to go away, I'm losing them, then I'll say, you know what? I'm just continuing to preach isn't going to do any good. Let me get to the application to bring this to a close. However long that should be. So you got to figure that out. And last fall I preached on hell. I preached on the subject of hell. And we have a large church, so we have a huge mix of believers, unbelievers, skeptics, all that. Traditional thinking, guys would tell me I was crazy for preaching straight up on the subject of hell. But I preached on hell for an hour and 5 minutes. And people stayed with me the whole time. And I'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute, about how I think about preaching. I think about preaching like, I'll get to it here in a minute, the analogy that I use. But don't abbreviate your messages. And I don't know how long you should preach. However long it takes for you to kind of dig it out, however long God's gifted you, for you to feed your people. But I do know that if it takes you 5 to 10 minutes to set up the rig, so to speak, takes you another 5 or 10 minutes to take it all down, how long are you drilling? How long are you drilling down into the good stuff? And if you're only spending 10 or 15 minutes in, it's probably not deep enough. And so your people need to feel nourished in that. And a non-believer will hang with you during that time if you're teaching the text, honest with it, addressing their objections, and getting to the application. They'll hang with you. All right? So let me read out of Romans 10, 14 through 15. It says, "How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news." So I just want to affirm you in that. If you feel that call to preach, that is a special honor that God has given to you, and you can you can hold on to the promise that is given to us in Scripture. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news, because without your preaching, there will be some who will never hear. And it is an amazing honor and privilege when somebody's eyes open up and their ears open up to the gospel because you were obedient to the task of preaching. I'll say this, preaching has been and it continues to be the crucible of my sanctification. Does that make sense to everybody? In other words, it's growing deeper as a believer is often found in the task of weekly preaching for me, that I realize that I've got to continue to dig my wells really deep if I'm going to have something to say every week. I've got to stay ahead of it. And I can't just get up there and pretend like I'm close with God. I've got to be close with God. And so the preparation just isn't in the study of the text. It's your personal walk with the Lord and digging those wells deep. And so let me get to kind of the main thing. What we're talking about here is how do you craft a sermon that speaks to the mind of a believer and addresses the objections of an unbeliever. And I think that that's one of the significant challenges, because in all of our churches, we should never want to pit against each other evangelism and discipleship. Right? We should never say, well, we're a church that just focuses on evangelism, or we're a church that just disciples others. Those two should not be in competition with each other. Those two should be working together. And I believe that they can. So the challenge of every serious preacher is simply this question: am I going to reach unbelievers or am I going to feed believers? And so which is it? It's got to be both. It's got to be both. And I think that there's a way to do it. So most criticism of preaching today either comes in this question, right? Have you ever had somebody come up to you and say, I just didn't think like your preaching was deep enough? Man, that cuts like a dagger, doesn't it? Especially when your heart is to give them some depth. But to some, they've got a sophisticated palate, like they're used to the steak, right? And maybe they're a little bit more sophisticated than where you're currently at. And maybe that's why they say that. But have you ever had others come up to you and say, I just can't hang with you. You're just too confusing. I mean, you're just so deep, and I just didn't know what to do with it. That equally cuts like a dagger. And so for me, it's like I often think to myself, how can I provide meat for the believer, and how can I serve up maybe Jell-O for the non-believer, the baby in Christ, somebody they don't know the Bible very well. How do I do that in the same sermon? And I think you can do that in the same sermon. I believe that biblical preaching not only can, but it should reach the mind of an unbeliever, and at the same time, feed the believer. It's not like this part of the sermon is for the unbeliever, and then you can check out now, this part is for the believer. I don't think it has to be that way. I think that God can use the same content simultaneously to do both things. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 2 says, I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. And so this is believers, unbelievers, welcomed and not welcomed, right? Reprove, rebuke, and exhort. Those are different things, aren't they? Reprove, rebuke, and exhort. He's telling us to do that in the same sermon. And then he says, do it with complete patience and teaching. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, it says, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. And so when we preach, I think we need to, you might write this out in your notes as you're preparing a sermon, or just have it handy. You need to ask yourself this question. When we preach, there will be those who are ignorant of the gospel. So as you're preparing your content, think to yourself, okay, who in this room just is totally ignorant of the gospel? It's not that they've rejected it yet or will. It's that they just don't know. They just don't know what it is. And in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 18, it addresses this. It says, they are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to their hardness of heart. So there'll just be people that'll walk in and they don't even know what they don't know, and you've got to address that in your preaching. And I will say this too: don't just preach to the people that are in your church. Preach to the people that you want to be in your church. Does that make sense to everybody? Don't just preach to the people that are there. In other words, for the first 3.5 years as a preacher, my church was 15 people. I knew who was going to be there every single Sunday. I knew their names. All of them were believers. And so I got in a rut where I started just developing my sermon to preach directly to those people. But I never started thinking through my sermons going, okay, how would that sound to an unbeliever? Now, when you start, I don't know how big your churches are or how many people you're preaching to. You can get caught in that. And what you want to do is, let's just say your church is maybe as big as what's in this room, and you know every single person in here is a believer. You come to a part in the text and you go, now some of you may not believe this. Now, do you think that there's anybody in there that doesn't believe it? No, everybody believes it. And they're kind of looking around going, really? It's like, do you not believe this anymore? But what will happen is just by you saying that, they'll go, this is a safe place for me to invite my friend. Because he just addressed somebody who doesn't believe. And a lot of people's biggest objections to inviting their friends and family to church, at least in an American context, is I'm going to invite my friend and none of this is going to be applicable to them. That's why they don't invite them. Or the preacher speaks over their heads, or, you know what, I just don't think they would get it. But if you start saying, hey, some of you don't believe this, or some of you are objecting to this, what they'll do is say, hey, I'm going to invite my coworker because I heard him question this. And then they'll start bringing them. So you start preaching to the people that you want to be in the room, then eventually they'll show up. Same thing goes the other way. If you got a whole room full of unbelievers and you need some wisdom and some maturity in there, start speaking to the believer. And then all of a sudden people will go, hey, you know what, my neighbor's really looking for a good Bible teaching church. I'll invite them. Does that make sense to everybody? So when we preach, there's going to be people that are ignorant. The second thing is when we preach, there's going to be those who doubt the gospel. So they've heard it, but now they have doubts. And they've got questions, or maybe they've been hurt before. Jude chapter 1, verse 22 says, have mercy on those who doubt. And that's true in your preaching. Have mercy on those who doubt, and address the doubts in your sermon. And I think one of the worst things we can do is when you're preaching a difficult text and just blow right past the difficulty in the passage and never stop to address it. And you need to stop. Like if you read something difficult, go, you know what? That is really difficult to believe, isn't it? I've struggled with that. And what you're doing is you're building bridges into those who are receiving their doubts. I think the reason why a lot of people reject biblical preaching is they go, he's not honest with the objections. And if they knew that there was somebody who is relating to their doubts, that just gives a lending ear. And they go, oh, he just addressed my objection. I was gonna share this a little bit later. I still might, but now seems to be the right time to do it. I shared a little bit earlier that my grandfather was a first-generation Christian. Grew up in a non-believing home, rough family. The family split apart several times. My grandfather came from a big family, so he wasn't nurtured at all. But he goes and he gives his life to Christ in a very dramatic conversion. Immediately goes to seminary to become a preacher. That's a dangerous combination. When you've never been emotionally nurtured, and this is like the 1950s, so he went to a Southern Baptist seminary, sort of legalistic. So his household, he was kind of hellfire and brimstone, very legalistic. My dad grew up in that environment. My dad was a very disillusioned preacher's kid. So some of you, I've met some of you who grew up you had parents who were in ministry that were great role models. And my dad didn't have that. My dad had a guy who was in ministry, a father who was in ministry that just didn't nurture him. So my dad didn't like the church very much. So he grows up, has me, marries my mom, who's a solid believer, basically took us to church because she wanted us to be in church. He was just not really in it. So here's the thing. As a little kid, driving home from church every Sunday, the thing I heard every Sunday was my dad making fun of the sermon. He would make fun of the preacher. He'd make fun of the sermon. He'd criticize it. Now I'm 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. And didn't really know any better. That's all I heard. Now here's the thing. A lot of that bitterness didn't get into my heart. I'm grateful for that. And my dad's doing a lot better now, by the way. But once I felt called to preach, here's the deal. I'd sit down to start writing a sermon, and my dad was in my head. And I would write something out. I would start writing a sermon, or I'd start going over it, and all of a sudden I'd hear my dad would pop up on my shoulder. You know, not literally, but figuratively. Like my dad would pop up on my shoulder, and he'd just make fun of it. You know, or he would punch holes in it. And it made me a better preacher. Because here's the thing. When I'm preaching, I'm almost overly sensitive to the skeptics. Probably too much at times. Because afterwards, I'll have people come up to me and they're like, hey, we already believe this. Why are you trying to, convince us of this? And I'm like, yeah, because the guy on the back row who's totally disengaged, I'm trying to reach him. And I know that there are more guys like my dad in our church. So I just imagine the conversations in the car on the way home, and I'm trying to speak to the skeptics, and I'm trying to address the objections. And when you address the objections, you disarm them. And all of a sudden you've got a hearing with them. And that's some of the greatest opportunities for the Holy Spirit to do His work. So ask yourself, where are the doubts going to come from in this passage? Here's the third thing. Those who rebel against the gospel. So they hear it, they know what it says, but they don't care. And they are still slaves to their sin, and they're not interested in changing. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 8 says, today if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts. But many will, and many do. And so you've got to address those people who know it, but they rebel against it. Here's the fourth thing. Those who just struggle with the gospel. And hopefully you've been there, because that's hopefully made you a better student of the Word, a better disciple. But it's people in your church that really want to get it, but they keep hitting roadblocks. And Hebrews chapter 12 addresses that in verse 4. It says, in your struggle against sin. So just understand that there are people that are struggling. So you got to give them some lifelines every single week and nurture them. There are people who are bruised, and there are broken reeds in your church. And God's called you through your preaching to minister them back to health. And the last thing is just those who are going to respond to the gospel. So they're in process. So how do you take them to the next step? And the challenge of preaching is you got to do all those things. So let me just give you some. We're at 5:15. Is that right? 5:25. So I'm going to give us some time to just have some dialogue and some Q&A here in a bit. But let me just get to some practical thoughts and suggestions here for effectively preaching to feed believers and engage unbelievers. All right, just some practical. These are just kind of random practical thoughts. The way I think about preaching a sermon is through a flight plan, so to speak. It's like getting on an airplane and going somewhere. So I think that whenever people come into our church, I almost kind of think like that's the terminal. We get everybody in there, get everybody together. We're going to go to the gate. We're going to take them down to the airplane, and we're going to get everybody on the plane. Then we got to take off. We got to get through the turbulence. We got to get up to a good flying level. We got to take them somewhere. Then we got to land the plane smoothly, and then we got to get them up to the gate and exit them off. And that's the way I think about a sermon. So start to think about this. If you don't have if you've not adequately prepared, if you've not thought through your introduction, if you've not thought through the way that you want to address the text, if you've not thought through the objections, and then my big thing, I have a tendency to work really hard on introduction and teaching through the text, and I don't spend as much time on the conclusion. Any of you with me in that? I don't know what it is. You just spend all this time on the front end. And have you ever done that, like in preaching? You're like getting through this preaching, and you get to the end of it, and you're like, man, I have no idea how to land the plane. I'm just going to keep circling the runway for a while, right? And then people start to get restless, or maybe you just don't get them there safely, or the plane never got off the ground. If you take people somewhere, they'll go with you. And they'll come back and they'll bring their friends the next week because they'll say, man, he's taking us somewhere. There's a progression to this. And so that's how I like to think about the sermon. Think about it in those steps. Make it your goal to give the listener something to receive, something to respond to, or something to reject. So in the sermon, you need to ask yourself, what is it that I'm asking them to receive? Am I asking them to repent? Am I asking them to change a behavior? Am I asking them to believe something different? You need to specifically spell it out. Be very clear. What am I asking them to receive? If they don't receive it, then you say, okay, what am I asking them to respond to? What's the specific message I'm asking them to respond to? And then the last thing is, what if they don't do that, what do they have to reject? Like if they're not going to receive it and respond to it, they've got to reject it. And they need to be very clear about what they're rejecting. And that's okay if they reject it. I mean, just read through the book of Acts. Did every one of Peter's sermons go real well? No. There were many, made fun of it, thought this is foolishness, but what did it say at the very end of that? But there were some who wanted to know more. There were some who believed. So some are going to reject it. This is as simple as I can make it. In biblical preaching, set up the text. Now you might, here we go. Set up the text, read the text. Now, do that in however order you want to do it. Some of you might start off with the text. That's great. You just start with reading the text and you're done. But set it up in some way. And what I mean by that is give the unbeliever this question that goes, why should I even listen to that passage? What's so great about it anyway? What is that passage saying that I need to listen to? That's what I mean by set it up. So whether you do that before you read the text or right after you read the text, make sure you do it. So if you read the text to start your sermon off, you could read it and then say, now here's why that text is so important. And then you just build it into it. Or you could set it all up, create this tension, and then address it. One way you might say it is create a tension in the room that is so palpable that people are begging you to resolve the tension through the text. And so that takes creativity. That's hard, right? And so you create this tension, and then people see that that's how people see that the Bible's relevant, is that you just addressed why they should listen to it. Then explain the text. Explain it. I love to just work down through a passage one sentence at a time and just kind of stop, do commentary, translate it, kind of bring it into today's vernacular so that way people can understand it. I'm having a lot of fun right now because I'm preaching through the life of Moses, and it's so much fun to do that. You just preach. There's a passage in Deuteronomy 34. It's right before Moses is preaching his last sermon. He's getting ready to die at 120. And it says in that passage that Moses' eyesight was still clear, and his the way the ESV says it, his vigor unabated, meaning his energy is relentless. And the way I just said it is, this guy's really, really old, but he could still beat you up, right? I mean, that's just how you just kind of work through you help them kind of understand what that means. You kind of bring it in. So you explain the text, and then you apply the text. So it's read the text, set up the text, explain it, apply it. Illustration should be the last thing to go in. Illustrate the application. Illustrate the application. So the mistake that I made as a young preacher is I would try to go out and find all the best illustrations first. Then let me build a sermon around all these great illustrations. Hopefully none of you have ever done that, but it's a temptation, right? You hear a great illustration, oh man, let me find a text, and let me find and let me build it all around that. The illustration should be the last thing to go in. It's like the salt to the meal. And so read it, explain it, set it up, apply it, and then just illustrate the application. And what illustrations do is it brings the application to life. And people go, oh, now I get it. Now I get it. And if the illustration is too prominent and people remember the illustration above the principle in the passage, you've illustrated poorly. And I hate to say that to you because that's so hard. I hate it when people come up to me, oh, we love your preaching so much. I mean, when you tell that story about your daughter, it's like, really? That's all you remembered is the story about my daughter? No, the story should help accentuate the principle in the passage, all right? I would say this. I know that a number of you are very interested in apologetics, and I'm very grateful for your discipline and the ability you have in that. And I'd simply say that teaching and explaining the Bible in a practical way is often the very best apologetic. So what I mean by that is there are, at least in the American context, this is so true, people have some kind of church experience in the American context, even though they haven't been to church maybe in years. So they think they know what the Bible says, but they really don't know what it says. Or the only time they read the Bible is when they get on an atheist website and see atheists butcher the context and pull it all out of context. And I always, like, whenever I get a young kid come into my office, I've just got a few objections to this whole thing. He pulls out his paper and he's reading off questions. I'm like, where'd you get those questions? Oh, I just thought these up on my own. Oh, really? Because I've heard those before. Did you get that from an atheist website? Yeah. And atheist websites, they don't pay attention to authorship, historic context. They don't pay attention to genre. They just rip it out of its context. So what you can do in biblical preaching is and this is why I love expository preaching so much, is just by teaching straight through a passage, showing them how it weaves with the rest of the meta-narrative of the Bible and why it relevantly makes sense, light bulbs will come on for people. And I've not even said the word apologetics, but it got done in the sermon because they saw that the Bible made sense. Even like, classic example, Jonah and the big fish, right? So many people have that objection. Oh, come on, And then the big fish swallowed Jonah, and Pinocchio was sitting next to him, And it's like this whole like fairy tale sort of thing. And we did a series through the life of Jonah. Our people they couldn't wait till I got to that passage because they're like, what are you going to do with that passage? What am I going to do with the passage? I'm going to teach it, did Jonah literally get swallowed by the fish? And that's what they wanted to know. And then when you get to that passage, just to be able to hit that squarely, unapologetically say, yes, I believe that this literally happened. Here's all the objections as to why people don't think it can happen. But you know what? It's even more arrogant of you to suggest that it didn't happen than for you to believe that it did. Come on, think about it. In that time, let's just say we could go back in time and spend time with Jonah and the other prophets, and we could say, hey, one day, in our day, we've developed a machine where you can get into a machine and take you down to the bottom of the ocean, and you can survive for months. They would think you're crazy, right? They couldn't even imagine that kind of technology. And so yet we've got a God who created all of the universe, and it didn't say that a big fish came and just swallowed Jonah. It said God provided. God provided a big fish. This is God working it. So you address that, you hit it straight up, and you can go, you know what? I unapologetically believe that this happened, and here's why. And people are kind of startled by all of that. And so teaching is often the best apologetic. Yeah, here's the other thing. Be honest with your struggles, failures, and doubts. Don't come across as if you've got it all figured out. Preachers have a tendency to make themselves the heroes of the illustration. Or they make themselves, they can go the other way. You can go the other way too. And you're like always the loser. Always the one that never gets it figured out. You got to be careful of doing that too. Because all of a sudden they'll go, now why are we listening to you? Like you don't seem to have your stuff together. You got to figure that out. I have a lot of respect for Martin Lloyd-Jones. He never used personal illustrations. I don't know how. I can't do that. He never did that because he never wanted himself to hijack the sermon. You got to be careful with making yourself the hero or the pathetic dope. You got to be careful of those two things. I just got done preaching a series on parenting in our church. So we just talked about what the Bible says about parenting and the task of parents. I've got 4 kids at home, so I had lots of really good illustrations. And I had to be really careful. I was preaching, like the third series in the third sermon in the series, I was talking about discipline. And how if your kids can figure out a way to push boundaries, they will. And when you let them get away with it, you enable poor behavior. And you create a dependent monster. And I was speaking really directly to our church. Like, some of you need to discipline better. Some of you need to get a backbone. And I could sense it in the moment. Like, they're going, wow, do you have all this figured out? And I stopped and I said, look, I'm not saying this at you. I'm saying this with you. And as soon as I said that, you could see people's body language change. Like, oh. And so then I just gave an illustration of how I was, my son loves the Xbox. And he loves video games. He's 10 years old, going on 11. And I had written this sermon on discipline and parenting. I was in my home office going over it out loud on Saturday afternoon. And on Friday, my son got in trouble for talking back to his mom. So I took the Xbox away for the weekend. I said, you can't play it. And so I'm going over my sermon in my study. Guess what I hear turn on in the other room? Boom, bing! The Xbox, however that sound goes. And he turned it on. He started playing it. He knew that he had it taken away for the whole weekend. I think he was just thinking that I wouldn't notice. So here I was faced with a decision. Am I going to continue to go over my sermon on parenting? Or am I going to go be a parent and walk into the room and actually employ what it is that I'd prepared? I shared that with our church the next day. The most effective thing I shared all morning long. Because they thought, he's right in the trenches with us, and he doesn't have it all figured out. And I wasn't the pathetic dope, yet I wasn't the hero of the illustration. So pay attention to that. I already said this, anticipate the objections and address them. Let me say this. What is the text calling you to believe? What is the text calling you to change? What is it calling you to do? When is it calling you to do it? And what difference will it make? Before you preach, have those questions addressed. What is the text calling you to believe, to change, to do? When is it calling you to do it? And what difference will it make if you do? And let me just wrap up with this. Preach with gravity. And what I mean by that is that there should be a heaviness to your words where people say, what we're hearing really matters. Because it does matter, doesn't it? This is life and death. And somebody can be out there, and what they'll hear you teach from God's Word may radically change their lives. Anticipate that every single time you step up into the pulpit. Preach with gravity, because this really matters. Preach with the authority that the Scriptures give you. No other authority than that. Don't preach with your own authority. Preach with the authority that the Scripture gives you. Preach with humility, because God is still at work within you, and you don't have it all figured out. And I'd say this. Have you ever heard the phrase, preaching is truth through personality? You ever heard that description of preaching? Preaching is truth through personality. That's a common description. I don't know who came up with that originally, but that's a common description of preaching. And I would say that that is only partly true. That preaching isn't just truth coming through your personality. It's incomplete. The truth of Scripture should overshadow the personality of the preacher. And so that should come out more than anything else. And I'll just kind of conclude with this, and then we'll open up to Q&A. As I shared earlier with my dad kind of being a little bit skeptical of church, I have a huge heart for reaching young skeptical men. And so when I preach, I kind of gear a lot of my content towards the skepticism primarily of men. And one of the things that I love to hear, I think it's a starting place, is when women will come up to me and they'll say, with tears in their eyes, they'll say, this is the only church I can get my husband to go to. And I'll say, wow, well, tell me about him a little bit. And they'll say, well, he's still not a believer. He still doesn't believe any of this. But he believes you believe it. And he likes you. So he keeps coming back for that. He believes you believe it. And I guess I would simply say that in your preaching is that can people say that about you? When you're up there and you're preaching, the most jaded skeptic Could they honestly say, you know what, I don't believe this yet, but man, I'll tell you what, I believe you believe it. And God will take that and He'll begin to multiply it in that person's life. I tell those ladies all the time, keep bringing him back. Keep bringing him back. Because what will happen is he'll slow. My favorite story ever is there's the Brazilian jiu-jitsu champ started attending our church. Big guy, fighter. His name's Chris. And his wife, Angela, was attending our church for about 6 months. He would never come with her because he's like, I don't need that church stuff and, whatever, all of his objections. She was coming without him. And we started a series on James at the very beginning of the year. New Year's resolution, he decided to go to church with her. And so I got up and I preached. It was not what he was expecting. And so he just kind of started attending with her every week. And she came in to see me one day, and she said, I came home from running errands one afternoon, and I caught him at the computer. And he was quickly trying to shut it down before I could get into the room. And I didn't know if he was looking at something that he didn't want me to see or what. And I felt horrible. I thought, this is awful. So immediately I was like, what are you looking at? And he was like, no, nothing. And so she gets on, she fires it up, looks at the history. He was listening to sermons. And so tears in her eyes. She's like, I never thought I'd see that day where I would come home and my husband would be at the computer listening to sermons and not want me to see it. And it all started where he goes, hey, I like that guy. And I don't know that I believe all this, but I believe he believes it because he's preaching content with passion and giving the application. And I just want to encourage all of you with that. That's the way you feed the mind of a believer and you address the unbeliever. And hopefully what will happen is the believers in your church will see the unbelievers being engaged, and that'll fire them up. And if anybody ever comes up to you and says, man, just give us depth, just give us depth, just say to them, you're as deep as the last person you led to Christ. You're as deep as the last person. So all the head knowledge doesn't do you any good if you're not employing it and leading people to Jesus. You all need to take what I say and translate it into your cultural context. I think that probably goes without saying. Some of your cultural context may be a little more quiet and reserved in nature. So your people may be really into it, but body language, you wouldn't necessarily know it, and then others are maybe different. I'm not naturally a very boisterous kind of a guy, so I don't necessarily scream and pound and do anything like that. And I think that you need to, passion doesn't necessarily mean that you're enthusiastic and loud and jumping around. Passion just means I believe this, and there's a gravity to what I'm saying. Does that make sense? So it's not like it's just dry, I'm trying to get through the material. But there's a thus saith the Lord, and there's a call to action. And so I think the Old Testament prophets are great to learn from in this. I think oftentimes we picture them as screaming and yelling, but I don't know that all of them did. So I think the other thing, you got to be true to the culture, your culture in your country, the culture of your church, and then your personality. And then ask yourself, how do I communicate this in such a way that I'm calling people to action? That's really what you want. You don't want to fabricate passion. You just want to call people to action. You don't want them to sit down, hear it, and walk out unchanged. You want them to be changed. So you figure out how you do that, how God's wired you to do that. The question is as you're preaching weekly, how do you make sure that you do your own personal devotion time and then your sermon prep time? So you've almost kind of got two dual messages going on there. And I don't know about you, but sometimes the temptation for a preacher is to never work on their own personal relationship with the Lord. They're just going to the Bible to get a sermon together. That's the only time you ever spend in it. I would say that I'm kind of split on this one. I don't think it's a clean, cut, dry answer. I do believe that God can do a personal work in you as you're doing preparation for your sermon. And He should. So I don't think you should feel guilty about saying, oh man, I had to do all the time in the Word that I spent this week was developing a sermon. I never got to my personal Devo time. Well, it's still God's Word, and you still got to believe it, and I think God can still use it. But I think you got to do, and only you can do that honest evaluation of yourself to say, am I personally pushing myself to grow, or am I not? And then the other thing I'd say, just as far as time management, is to say, I kind of think about days of my week like buckets. And so if I don't say, okay, on Monday, here's everything that goes into this bucket that I'm going to get done. If I don't do that, I'm ADD. I have attention deficit disorder. So I'm like, oh, there's a butterfly. It's like, oh, there's this over here, this email. And so like trying to sit down and concentrate on a sermon and get it all the way done from beginning to end is just hard for me. I can sit down and work on a sermon for about 2 hours, and then I have to go do something else. And then I come back and work on it for 2 hours and then go do something. Some of you, God bless you. You can sit down and crank it all out in 10 hours or whatever. And I despise you. But I think that you got to ask yourself, okay, on this day, I'm going to do personal devo, and then I'm going to do this and this and this. And then on Tuesday, I'm not going to do that over there. I'm going to do sermon prep. And so that way you make sure that you're taking progress. You just got to be highly disciplined with your schedule. And it drives me nuts when preachers get to Saturday and they haven't done their prep. So you do it early in the week. The question is, how long does it take me to prepare a sermon, and what's the process for preparing a sermon? It's changed over the years. So I'd say understand that for you. You ever gone into a gym and lifted weights you haven't lifted for a while, and you're sore for about 2 weeks, and then you can kind of build on that? Seems like God does that with me in preaching. And so what worked with me for a while, all of a sudden, I feel like I need to change, and so I go back into the gym and I lift weights and I'm sore and it's weird, and then I come out with a new process. I'm a manuscripter, so I write it out word for word. I don't know how many of you manuscript? How many of you outline? How many of you do kind of a combination of each? Yeah, so you've got kind of that kind of thing going on. I'd say go with what works for you. I manuscript because it helps me really think through the wording, and I just think it's such an important thing on Sunday when that many people come together. I never want to run off on a rabbit trail. I ran off on a few rabbit trails today because I didn't manuscript this. So it's like I just outlined it. So I manuscript it to stay disciplined with where I'm going. I probably spend total package, study, writing, and going over 15 to 20 hours a week. On a high level, I plan out sermon series about 18 months in advance. 6 months is almost certain that's what we're going to do. The remaining 12 months could change, but at least I know. I think about it as serving up a well-balanced meal. So I know people heard some sort of content in my church this last year. There's going to be a whole bunch of people that are going to come to our church next year, never heard that content. So we really mix it up between topical, textual, and expository. We always do a series on the family, either marriage or parenting, every year. So we just do the scope of 18 months, put together a series. We're going to preach through a book. We're going to do a series. Plan all that out at a high level. And then I don't write the sermon until the week of. Now I'll keep an Evernote file, and I know where I'm going, so if I hear something or come across an illustration or something that's going to fit, I'll keep it in Evernote, so that way it pops up the week of. But Mondays are meeting days for me. Mondays, I'm just so tired. I don't know about you guys, but nothing's in the tank for me on Monday. So I come crawling into the office on Monday, mostly meetings, but about an hour at the end of my afternoon, I'll open up the sermon, read through the text. I'll take a stab at outlining it, and I'll take a stab at what I think the primary application is. And then Tuesday morning, everything's blocked off. It's study and writing all day Tuesday. So I sit in front of the computer. I wrestle. Writing, sermon delivery is my favorite part of preaching. Sermon research and writing is like prison for me. And it's like, I wish that I'm praying that God will make it more enjoyable for me, but it's just hard. And I just sit in front of the computer, and I second guess it, and I question it, and I want to throw everything away and never preach again. It's just hard. And as I wrestle through all that out, God kind of brings out this material. I just found that there's no other way for me to do it. And I try to write 4,000 words, which is about 4 pages of material. I do single space, no margins. I'm just weird that way. I just try to utilize the full page. And so I try to get 2 pages written on Tuesday. Wednesday I come in early and sit down at the computer and try to finish it by 2 or 3 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon. 4,000 word manuscript, 4 pages. and then I email it off to our creative team, and they develop slides. The music team takes a look at the songs, see if they'll apply to anything, and then go and do other stuff. Come in early on Thursday morning, and I'll actually read through it out loud. The first 2 pages I'll try to read out loud 3 or 4 times. Then on Friday, which is my day off, I'll take my kids to school. I'll try to read through the second 2 pages 3 or 4 times. Saturday morning, I get up before my family gets up and go over the whole thing twice. Sunday morning, I get to the church at 6 a.m., go over the whole thing twice. That's my process. It's grueling. It is tiring. But what it does is people tell me all the time, they're like, man, how do you preach without notes? I'm like, they're up here. I just don't look at them very much. And I spend a lot of time internalizing. I wish I had a photographic memory. I know some of you do. But I don't have that. I just try to internalize it, try to make eye contact with people. And I preach twice on the weekends, getting ready to preach a 3rd time on the weekends. Start the process all over again on Monday.